Hello, my friends, hello, and welcome once again to the Rustic Von Lodge, where I'm going to be talking about Stephen King again. I'm reading every book by Stephen King. I'm reading them in publication order. I've read every book of the 1970s. I'm in the 80s now, specifically 1981, and this book, Cujo, Stephen King's novel Cujo, about a St. Bernard, a 200-pound St. Bernard who gets rabies. That's not a good thing in a horror novel. So Cujo, a good dog basically, a good big dog, but he's bitten by a bat who has rabies. And so he becomes an enraged monster who, kills folks and causes trouble. So, Stephen King's Cujo. I first read this book when I must have been about 17 years old. That's my best guess, because I think I was still in high school when I read it. So I must have been around 17 when I read this, and I remember there were a lot of things about this book I didn't like. I didn't like all the digressions. I didn't like the extensive backstory that Stephen King felt like he had to give every single character. I thought this was basically a monster story, really. It was about this enraged St. Bernard who has rabies, who kills people. And traps our main character Donna and her son in this car and won't let them out. And so it's a survival story basically. But there's a lot of other things going on in this book. And when I first read this, I was like, why is all this other boring stuff in here? This isn't what this book is about. It's about a big St. Bernard that wants to eat folks. That kind of thing. This could have been, 150 pages shorter, in my opinion. And it's not a terribly long book, especially for Stephen King. It's a little over 300 pages. So not a long Stephen King book by any means. And so there were a lot of things I didn't like the first time I read this. I was surprised reading this again because I had a whole different experience this time. True, I am very old now. I'm a middle-aged man knocking on death's door. And so perhaps because I'm so elderly, that is one of the things that made me read this differently. And I did have a very different experience reading this. First of all, a lot of the stuff I didn't like the first time I read it, I actually enjoyed this time. I liked the extensive backstories on all the characters. It made the characters seem more real. Some of the comic relief stuff about certain characters didn't really work this time any more than it worked the first time I read it. But you kind of expect that kind of thing from Stephen King. Not everything works in Stephen King's books. That's okay, I forgive him for it. His books are entertaining, so what the hell. And there was a lot of stuff that had nothing to do, seemingly, with a rabies-crazed St. Bernard. And that's because this novel is all about domestic misery. It's about the misery and the dread and the fears of domestic suburban people. And so I think you probably have to be an actual adult to kind of understand what this book is about. Otherwise, yeah, it's just going to seem like, why aren't we just reading more about the killer St. Bernard? Why are we going on and on about this guy's job and how he's afraid he's going to lose his job, and this woman who's afraid of wasting her life basically as a housewife in this completely unfulfilling life when she could be doing something else, but she doesn't know what. It's about that kind of thing, really. And Cujo is the ultimate. Cujo points out how a lot of those things that we're afraid of and dread in our boring suburban lives are really nothing compared to real terror. Cujo's really dangerous. This poor dog, who was a good dog, basically, and just had the bad luck of getting bit by a, a bat who had rabies and became an enraged psychopath dog. The dog, Cujo, who was this big 200-pound monster, this is real danger. He kills people and, tears them apart and things like that. That's real danger. And Donna, the main character, experiences that firsthand. Cujo is owned by this guy named Joe Camper, who is a mechanic, and his mechanic shop is on his property in this big barn he's got way out in the country. And he's got a son and he's got a wife who have their own domestic issues. And the story of his family is a pretty major part of this. Again, it's showing you some of the dread and the horrors of basic domestic life, or what they could be. And so they've gone out there before to have their car fixed, and so she takes her son to Joe's garage out there to have their car fixed, and that's where they encounter Cujo, who has become an enraged monster, and they are trapped in the car. Car breaks down totally at that point, and so they're literally trapped, and so it becomes a tale of absolute survival. Can they survive this situation? How are they going to survive this situation? And this is serious business. This isn't just, I'm unfulfilled in my life. This dog is going to tear me to pieces. This is serious. And so it's talking about these different things. And it's about, like I said, domestic misery, but it's about how much worse things could get. Like I said, Cujo is real danger. And the suspense parts of this book are really well done. Anything to do with Cujo was actually, frankly, scary. There were some frankly scary moments having to do with the dog. And that stuff Stephen King did really well. There are some parts in this that don't work. He probably does go on a little bit too much with Donna's husband, Vic. He's an advertising. He works in the advertising business, and he might lose this big client, and he might lose his job, and so you have those kind of worries and fears, and it probably goes too much into that, too much into some other stuff, probably, but I didn't mind it this time when I read it. It actually, for the most part, went along at a pretty good clip for most of it. There was some boring stuff in the front half. There's also this bit about how little Tad, Donna's son, might have a supernatural being in his closet. There might actually be a boogeyman haunting his closet. We never know for sure, but his closet could be haunted. And this, his fear of this thing, whether it's real or not, Stephen King is kind of like, yeah, there's something going on here. But Tad's fear of the monster in the closet, the famous fear that children have, is all tied up with how he experiences being menaced by Cujo. It's actually pretty well done, although it remains vague. Possibly I was annoyed by that the first time as well, but not so much this time. Because I think most of this book works really, really well. It is basically a monster story, but you have characters that are pretty sympathetic. And Donna, the main character of this book, most of this book is really about Donna and, her situation in her life and her relationship with her son and her domestic concerns. She is sympathetically portrayed, I think. I've heard other reviewers of this book say otherwise, but I think Stephen King was sympathetic to Donna and her situation. And I think a lot of the character work in this book works really, really well. Stephen King did a good job with the characters in this. Some things, like I said, don't work. The dialogue in places just doesn't work. Some of the dialogue feels like it was right out of a melodramatic television show. Like when people say things like that they would never actually say in real life. You know, people just don't talk like this sometimes. Have you ever seen that show, This Is Us? I think that's This Is Us, and like everybody talks in a way that nobody would ever talk in real life. Like nobody talks like this ever. There's a little of that kind of thing going on in here, where the dialogue sounds like it's from television, as opposed to somebody speaking in real life. But it's not too bad, you know. And from what I remember, Stephen King does get better at that as he goes along. And not all of the dialogue is like that. But there's some moments in this where it's just like, oh, come on, no one would have this conversation like ever. But that's okay. That's okay. I forgive a lot, you know, if the book entertains me. And this book did entertain me. And there were moments when I'm like, and the ending of this, a lot of you probably know how this ends, but I'm not going to tell you. But it's pretty hard hitting. This gets really savage towards the end of this book. I mean, this is one of those take no prisoners kind of endings, you know. He just didn't pull any punches, which you know, I appreciate. This is not like one of those, oh, it's all okay in the end type of books. It's not. This is horror. This is real horror right here. It starts off in the beginning of the book. You didn't really know if it was going to go in that direction, but man, by the end of the book, it's like, yeah. So I liked it. I will shut up now. I've gone on long enough about Cujo. But I think this was a pretty darn good book this time reading it. It does work better when you read this as an adult, I think. Yeah, so Cujo, it's pretty good. I think the next book I'm going to read from Stephen King is The Gunslinger, I think. I'll double check, but I know that's a very different book. And so I'm looking forward to that, actually. So yeah, but this one, Cujo, I liked it. Okay, guys, I will catch you next time.
Rhonda, why are you so terrifying? Were you a terrifying creature?